It's a real pleasure to be here today with all these panelists. Now, this is the first time many of these panelists have met me, but I actually know them quite well. I'm a historian writing an intellectual biography of Milton Friedman, and so I have been poring over the work of the scholars collected here. We've been having long conversations and arguments in my office, and it's really a pleasure to come now and actually have this conversation in person. So thank you for including me. And I have to say, I've accrued a tremendous debt to all the scholars here, and so I want to say thank you collectively. Now, I count myself as one of those old-fashioned people, perhaps more numerous than I previously thought, who does think there was a first Chicago school. And I think one of the ways this can be seen is through the career of Milton Friedman. Now, I'm obviously not the first person to say this. Many of you know that Friedman himself got in a lot of trouble for making this claim. His colleague Harry Johnson accused him of scholarly chicanery for suggesting there was such a thing as a distinctive Chicago school in the 1930s when he was a student. And that particular argument had to do with monetary theory. It's generated no less than 3 published volumes. You'll probably hear people arguing about it here today. Thankfully, I'm not there in my research to the period when monetarism becomes Friedman's focus, so I'm about up to 1940, so I'm not going to be focusing on that. Today I'm going to talk about Friedman in the 1930s. And the way a lot of the documents work is to get at Friedman in Chicago. We have to look backwards. There's a lot from his student years. There's pretty rich documentation, but the sort of implications of it, I think, don't really come out until we go a few years back. So what I'm going to do today is share some of what I found about the years after Chicago that I think reflects back on Chicago, and use that to argue for the distinctiveness and cohesion of an early Chicago school. So let me begin with a sort of capsule summary of Friedman at Chicago. He arrived in the fall of 1932. The Depression was well underway. Bank runs were not yet a major phenomenon, but unemployment was around 25%. There were breadlines in major cities. It was clear there was a crisis at hand. Friedman had come after a childhood growing up in the small town of Rahway, New Jersey. He had this sort of prototypical American childhood. He's the far one on the left there. He went from New Jersey, from his hometown, as many bright young students did, to Rutgers University. And that's where at Rutgers he met Homer Jones, who we saw a brief mention of, and Arthur Burns. And these two economists they were early in their careers, and they met Friedman even earlier in his. They became very influential teachers of his. He said it was Jones who introduced him to, quote, what was even then known as the Chicago view. This is Friedman looking back. What was the Chicago view? He said it was, quote, stress on individual freedom, cynical and skeptical about attempts to interfere with the exercise of individual freedom in the name of social planning or collective values. The school did not see the Depression as signifying a structural change in the economy. It was something we had seen before, maybe only worse. And this really comes in contrast to another popular set of ideas explaining the Depression, the underconsumption overproduction thesis, which really saw, if you were an underconsumptionist, the Depression was really making manifest some sort of structural flaw in capitalism or the American economy itself. The government had to do something, and it needed to be a presence in economic life to balance out the imbalances that were sort of inherent to the way capitalism worked. Here we are talking about Chicago views of the Great Depression. In contrast to underconsumption, overproduction thesis, Chicago tended to favor, speaking broadly, a monetary interpretation. That is, looking at flaws in current arrangements or institutions or politics, most particularly the banking system, most obviously from 33 onward when the crisis became so apparent in the financial system. But this is key. Government needed to help in the relief efforts. But once you fix the basics, once you made some of these necessary reforms, government would no longer be needed. This also comes out even before the banking crisis in a 1932 memo sent to Congress, signed by many members of the department. The immediate question was, should Congress accelerate a bonus payment to veterans? They said no, almost everyone said no, but then they went on to sort of describe their broader rationale. And the Pettingill memo emphasized, quote, emergency expenditures must be reduced as rapidly as is possible without undermining recovery. They talked about a, quote, temporary expedient, and they used emergency as a modifier almost any time they talked about a policy for the Depression. So there's a very clear sense we're in an exceptional time. Things are different. This is emergency economics or emergency recommendations, not what we would do if we were in a different situation. So these are sort of the contrasts coming out. Is this a structural problem and we need ongoing government intervention, or is this a crisis situation? We've got a house on fire, we need to put out the fire, but we should not proceed as if that's a normal course of events. So going back to the narrative, Friedman does his first year at Chicago in 1932, 1933. He then does a second year at Columbia in 1933, 1934. And this is where you really see the difference between these approaches to the crisis and to economics itself. Now, Columbia, rather than favoring price theory, really took the institutional approach. Ideas that were sort of verboten at Chicago, planning, social control, these were bad things at Chicago, these were good things at Columbia. Now, during his year at Columbia, Friedman actually, this is when he first taught price theory as a graduate student to other graduate students. Columbia did not even teach any of this, any economic theory or any approaches, and so he decided, I will teach my own course on price theory. So you can see he's going into the opposing camp, but it's already been set that price theory is sort of the favored approach, and he wants to now start evangelizing it to other students. Now, over time, the Columbia approach would feed into a number of theses that would shape the New Deal. It has much to do with underconsumption over production. Eventually, that would shift into administered prices. So there's a whole set of changing ideas. And the most fascinating thing about the 1930s is the way these ideas are emerging and being reformulated, and the real sense of grappling with crisis from economists, no matter what their orientation, what their school is. They're all wondering, how do we fix the problem? How do we stabilize the situation? Now, Friedman from Columbia goes back to Chicago, 1934, 1935, finishes his doctorate, goes to DC, works on the study of consumer purchases. Then he moves to New York, where he works full-time at the National Bureau of Economic Research. And this is where he is in 1937, 1938, the years of the so-called Roosevelt recession. This is a double dip, a recession inside a depression. It changes the game, it changes the consensus. Nobody saw it coming. They don't know how to understand it. In retrospect, what emerged from this is what we call Keynesianism, although it has many homegrown American antecedents. It became framed around the work of Keynes's general theory over time. In policy terms, it's the, quote, fiscal revolution, the defining policy of American liberalism, that the government needs to spend to raise the national income. This is the way out of the crisis and the way to keep the crisis from coming back. This draws on the underconsumption overproduction thesis that's been circulating from the 1920s. It also draws on a sense of secular stagnation, this idea that we are in a new moment in our economy, much of it having to do, interestingly enough, with the closing of the frontier. Roosevelt himself made this comparison in his speech introducing his new policies. He argued that just as once the federal government had encouraged and underwritten settlement across the West, now that the settlement of the West was over, the government needed to spend to support national income. And that would be the policy thenceforth. So coming back to Friedman and the first Chicago school, many economists came to find this set of ideas plausible, and much work was done sort of refining and understanding how to affect and instantiate the fiscal revolution. Friedman did not. Here he is writing to Arthur Burns in September 1940 after a cross-country road trip. Quote, the whole West, particularly California, and more particularly Southern California, gives you the feeling that the frontier is not yet gone and makes you feel like telling the stagnationites to come out and take a look. Now, I think the best way to get at his dissent from that consensus in the late 30s, 1940s, is to look at his teaching. I've already mentioned the first time he taught price theory was at Columbia when he was a graduate student. Now, although he's working full-time at National Bureau of Economic Research, he goes back to Columbia in the Extension School and is teaching the structure of neoclassical economics. I think Dan Hammond mentioned this briefly. Now, the first thing to notice, this is the fall of 1939, is that this is the class he wanted to teach. Price theory, not anything new, not the new approaches that are coming, not how we're grappling with the crisis. It's very much the same thing he was teaching in 1933, 1934, and what he was learning in 1932. So there's a real continuity there. His notes for the first few lectures survive, so we can get a little glimpse beyond the syllabi that Hammond showed us into what he talked about. And his class looked very much like a class taught by Frank Knight, if Frank Knight had ever used an outline, which apparently he did not. So Friedman began with the question of, quote, how free enterprise solves the economic problem. He then ran through the 5 functions of an economic organization, which you'll recognize from Knight's textbook. And he then continued on the Knightian theme of wanting as a key part of economics. And he used this idea of wanting to directly attack the idea of stagnation. As he told his class, and these are notes, so they are not totally grammatically correct. There's impossibility of completely satisfying all wants. If the greatest want is the desire for new wants, and this can be satisfied only by satisfying old wants, the notion of satiety is silly. And then he goes on to say, our attitude towards all public policies will be affected by our ideas concerning wants. So here I just sort of pulled these out so we could see them. So he's talking about essentially the idea that there will be, it's almost a philosophical conception of human wanting as something that's ceaseless and never satisfied. So we're never going to be done. There's always a potential of more growth. And then going directly into how that affects your attitudes towards public policies. So some of this, and as I'll continue, is why I think we do have evidence for his early political views. I think there's a politics embedded in this economics. It's very clear. I don't think there was a libertarian conversion that Friedman went through in the late 1940s. I think his skepticism of government is very deep, and much of it comes from early Chicago. Now let's move on to the next teaching gig that Friedman had. He went in 1940 to the University of Wisconsin. They did still graze sheep on the lawns in the academic buildings when he got there. And here Friedman taught a course on business cycles. And this is actually really interesting to read his, it's not his notes, we have very detailed notes from a student who took the class. And you can see Friedman is both teaching business cycles and pretty much thinking there probably isn't a thing as a business cycle. So he's arguing with himself as he's doing the notes. You can see his frustration coming out in it. I want to focus on the last lecture of the class when he kind of opens up into the big picture. Now remember, this is 1940. We're teaching business cycles. We're still pretty much in a very down business cycle. And here's what Friedman has to say. This is his last lecture. Is there long-run unemployment in sight? Maybe, but we can't tell yet. Therefore, that's the end of the quote. So it's best to assume, quote, no structural changes in the economy have occurred. The last 10 years are not an exceptional period in the history of the century. So again, pulling out the sort of conclusion. There is no long-run unemployment in sight, so it's whatever we've experienced in the Great Depression is not for him long-run unemployment. And these last 10 years do not represent an exceptional period in the history of the century. He then goes on, more echoes of the sort of Chicago views. Normal activity is the ups and downs of the business cycle. Control is intended to create an abnormal situation. Control is social control, the idea of planning, the idea of the institutional economist. And this last lecture is particularly revealing for what he taught, what specific reforms he proposes. We get 100% money, straight up Simons. But in some ways, he then goes on to take another step even beyond his Chicago professors in his disillusionment with the New Deal. He argues that you could say, quote, public works had an adverse effect on the price structure. Hence, no private investment. Also, other business practices of the New Deal, NRA, SEC. So here he's going on to suggest this relief spending that favored by his professors at the outset of the Depression did not actually turn out to be benign. And he's also calling out specific aspects of the New Deal that he thinks had this adverse effect on the price structure. He's also absolutely not buying the central New Deal argument about the causes of 1937-38 recession. He says, quote, "We could argue that government intervention made for lack of recovery." And then he goes on to poke holes in the statistics used by Lachlan Curry and Alvin Hansen, which were sort of at the centerpiece of the argument for the fiscal revolution. He goes through the statistics. You remember, he's a statistician saying they're not done properly. He stresses expectations. The important thing is not the government spending, but the government's announcement that it would spend. He says we must look at all government activities, not a select few, take a broader look. And he concludes the government spending argument is not convincing. So he's simply not buying this idea that government needs to boost national income. He's not buying the fiscal revolution. And then he closes by coming back to something that sounds straight out of that memo from 1932. Deficit spending is, of course, inevitable for relief, and keep it as low as relief requirements make possible. So I submit that in all of this, you hear the voice of Chicago speaking. Now, it's not the only reason. I think his work within the government, his work at National Bureau, also played a role. But Chicago did represent a distinct ideological and methodological location within the economics profession. It represented a distinct interpretation of the Great Depression and the New Deal. And we see the legacy of the first Chicago school coming through very clearly in Friedman's teaching. Thank you very much.
Good morning. This is joint work. My co-author has a real job. The first Monday of every month, she has an academic council meeting, so she's there. The approach you're going to take is a Stiglerian one, which is to say that what is important about what is taught is what is learned. So we're going to point to the Knightian, or what we interpret as Knightian positions in Stigler's writing over his career. We're going to focus on open problems because those are distinctive. We have 7 slides. The first 4 are things we pointed to in our Palgrave's article on Stigler. The next 2 are later, and the final slide is an attempt to pull things together with a testable hypothesis. How about that? And so the deep Knightian, in case you don't recognize the typography, this being a religious occasion, we're using the old biblical printing tradition that there's a certain status accorded to things that are in red. Some of you will recognize that, others will not. That the deep Knightian point of view is that group goals are endogenous. And of course, there's many, many ways of interpreting these words. And this is obviously quite late in Stigler's career. But the thing we want to flag is to say that such policies are mistaken is to say one cannot explain them. And so this is, and we'll focus on that sort of line of argument. Now, Stigler in some parts of the world remains enormously famous because of his diet problem. Stigler computed a minimum cost diet, and the data set he used was used by George Danzig to test out the simplex. Danzig shaved, 4 or 5 cents off Stigler's solution. And it's regarded in the operations research literature as absolutely bizarre, just absolutely bizarre. It's a tour de force. There's no 2 ways about that. But the solution is crazy because nobody in their right mind would eat that, would eat the diet, as Stigler says. And so here's where we think the Knightianism comes in. That no one can say with any certainty what the cultural requirements of a particular person may be. If dietitians persist in presenting minimum diets, they should at least report separately the physical and cultural components of those diets. Okay. Now, the question was raised from the audience, a really good question about microfoundations, right? Okay, if you take this point of view, well, there's macro foundations of microeconomics too. Yeah. Okay, we got a simultaneity problem. Okay, so if we know that, we can deal with it. And this is, I think, where the Knightian stuff is so interesting. Then something that's famous in welfare economics is Stigler's attack on sort of Calder-Hicks, and his proposed efficiency reform was to pay thieves not to steal, and the Calder-Hicks move is by compensating successful thieves for the amounts they would otherwise steal, we save those resources and hence secure a net gain. Okay, now he then points out that this is absurd, and the reason is Knightian. For surely the primary requisite of a working social system is consensus on ends. The individual members of society must agree on the major ends which that society is to seek. We know that's Knightian because he says so in his price theory book. This is pointed to as a Knightian welfare economics. So that's this text there clean. The next slide he had up was a reference to his price dispersion article in 1961, which was cited in the Nobel Prize as enormously important. And reminding everybody, the argument is each individual in the market faces a distinct array of prices for the same commodity. And there's a good reason to believe the arrays will differ. Okay? And so the takeaway is that we want to push is that information known to I isn't the same as known to J. And the question of monopolistic competition, the argument with Chamberlain, which is, of course, not the argument with Robinson because there wasn't one. But the argument with Chamberlain, I think the final shot from Stigler's point of view is price dispersion. So you've got the same commodity, different prices, right? So you don't have to do the Chamberlain mucking around with different compositions of the commodities. You can just work with a distribution of prices, and so you can still work with something like competition in a more general stuff and do everything that Chamberlain claimed to be able to do, but do it neater. Okay. And then there's something that I have to appeal as a witness. This is something I saw when I was studying for my prelims. I remember this question because it scared the wits out of me. Fortunately enough, I didn't have to face it. It was just on an old exam. And the question is this, in quotation marks, never a charge for credit, close quote, is equivalent to, open quote, never a discount for cash, close quote. How does economics explain the choice of those who do not realize the equivalence? Okay? And I asked, many years later, I asked Stigler about it, and he said, oh, yeah, it was his question, and no, he didn't know the answer. Okay, so this is, of course, typical. And thinking about this for a bit, you think information known to I isn't the same as known to J. Okay, so you think about it that way. And then the sort of the hypothesis we've got to connect all of these up is what we claim as a Knightian commonality, is a question about the possibility of making substitutions. If goals are predetermined, the outside expert could substitute the known goal into the action to determine of an agent to determine if the agent's action were efficient. And there's a once famous joke that Knight made about if an efficiency expert designed football, there would be 22 players on the same side, right? And so if the goal were to move the ball, right, okay, you work out the rest. Stigler's bribes, Stigler's diet problem seem to us to be, we don't know what the goals are, so we can't make those substitutions. The goal of society is not as Calder-Hicks would think of it, or Calder-Hicks is interpreted, it's probably better, is not just increased material well-being in some simple-minded sense. And so that the position I want to think about for Knight, the Knightian move, is all informational substitutes are questionable, which is to say, when you substitute, you switch truth values. And so Knight's risk can be substituted, so it's technically called extensional, same for everybody. A frequency distribution for you is the same as a frequency distribution for me. But Knight's uncertainty is different. What's uncertain for you is not the same as what's uncertain for me. So that's an intentional issue. And those are open questions. Thank you.
Sure. My name is Ted Kavadas. I'm a graduate of the business school here. I have a question for Jennifer. Maybe I misunderstood what you were trying to say, but with regards to Milton Friedman, you said that he had said with regards to the Depression and its possible fixes, government spending argument is not convincing. But then he also said government deficit spending is necessary at a minimum level. So am I understanding that correctly? Because it seems like it's at least somewhat contradictory in nature.
Thank you for the question. So let's see. The government spending argument is not convincing. The context in which he's talking about that is, so the 1937-38 recession happens, and everyone wonders why. And two economists in DC go and they look at the levels of government spending and they track the rise in the price level and the recovery with government spending and say, look, it recovered because we were spending. And then in 37, Roosevelt decided he was anxious the whole time about deficit spending. Everyone told him it was okay, you can do this, but he really wanted to sort of be a responsible, fiscally responsible. So he decided to cut the spending and to try to balance the budget, and then the economy goes down. And so then they track that and say, this is why we went down. Government spending was helping the recovery. We stopped spending. The economy went down. Therefore, we need to spend more to keep the recovery and to keep it stable. And then it goes on to be that sort of argument of stagnation and the closing of the frontier, that this is sort of our new normal. We are now in a new normal. So that is what Friedman does not buy. He does believe, as do many of his professors, that when you've got 25% unemployment, you've got people on the street, you've got people near the edge of starvation, the government has an obligation to address that through immediate relief spending to sort of staunch the wound. So that he will always consistently say, but he doesn't, it looks like from these notes, he doesn't think that's without costs. And he also thinks that should not be the sort of way that you keep an economy developing over time. Does that make sense?
Thank you, Jennifer. I agree with that assessment. Just one other point. I remember reading some memoirs of Jacob Viner in the early 1950s, who was a member of the Roosevelt administration, as you know. And he made the point that one reason he thought that a recovery never took place in the 1930s, at least in the early 30s, was because not only was because of the increased role of the government in the economy, not only in terms of deficit spending, which he thought was necessary, but in terms of other policies such as the NRA, which created a lot of uncertainty and therefore deterred businesses from investing. They thought that the economy was going more towards socialization, and there was not investment coming forth.
I missed whose memoir was that?
That was by Jacob Viner. It was written in about 1952, 53, a long memoir, which I came across on the internet a few years ago. Thanks.
I mean, I would just add to that that, Roosevelt was sort of throwing everything at the wall and seeing what would stick. So it's really hard to say New Deal really flattens out. You have to be really specific about what specific aspects people are reacting to or criticizing.
Hi, I have a question for Jennifer. In your discussion of Milton Friedman's influences, you left out one important influence of that period in the late 30s, which admittedly is not in the spirit of this meeting since it's not a Chicago influence. But it was the reason he went to Columbia was Harold Hotaling, and Hoteling's work on scarce resources seemed almost echoed in one of your quotations. He was also an important influence in the framing of the consumption function argument, and just wanted to get his name out into the discussion there.
Yeah, if I can respond, that's absolutely true. One thing that's really interesting is Friedman recollects Hotaling as a pure scientist without partisan affiliation, and he actually was not. He was quite well known and sort of controversial and almost considered a socialist. So Friedman took a slice from him, but he sort of missed a lot of it, or he didn't remember it. I mean, I found that this would be the case for all of us. Friedman's memory looking back often doesn't correspond with a lot of what you find documented. But thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I could have spoken for like 2 hours on all the different people that taught Friedman, but that is a very important one.
David, about the Knightian moment in Stigler. So what Knight knows and what Stigler knows from reading or listening to Knight may be different. So does what Stigler knows from Knight depend upon reading Knight? Do you think it comes from the classes? You think it comes first and foremost from the friendship and long time listening? What would be the sources of your reading of Stigler's reading of Knight?
Well, there's an easy answer. I don't know. I mean, one of the things that's just absolutely famous is remarks that come out of the period of how important fellow graduate students were. And so that there's not only the teaching, but there's the reflections of the teaching that are carried around. So I think it's, so there's a question of what you learned, and you've got classroom notes are really good for, and maybe the best thing for that. But you also have how these ideas get used. And that the question is then, can you identify ideas as they get used? And they've got to be, in some sense, they've got to be rather distinct and rather different than commonplace to be able to see them. Every now and again, you get Stigler saying that this is a Knightian position. So the question in welfare economics in '43 was clearly labeled as that. But where he got that, I don't know. I mean, his autobiography is not. It's full of really good jokes, but not a lot of where particular ideas came from. It's where attitudes came from. And that, for the kind of stuff we're doing, I don't find enormously helpful.
Hi, Dan Hammond, and I have a question for Jennifer. My sense is that Roe's director was much closer tonight than Milton Friedman was, and that when they came back to Chicago, that she was sort of the link between Friedman and Knight, and Knight would have had less influence on Friedman when he was a student. Would you have a comment about that? Knight's influence on Friedman?
Yeah, I wish I could say more about Roe's director and Roe's Friedman, and if anyone here can help me figure out some of the questions around that. She left a very thin paper trail, and so as a historian who likes to document things, I hear a lot, but I don't have a lot of evidence for it. But what I would say, yes, she's absolutely the link. She's the one who brings Friedman to the case for communism that first year. But I do think that his encounter with Knight was intense. It was profound, and I think you see a lot of the residues, not in a straight carry-through, but I'm very much agree with what Doug was saying in terms of the legacies that carry over. And I'm trying to trace that out in very different ways, but absolutely. Do you want to comment?
Yeah, if you look at Two Lucky People, sometimes there's distinctions between the two of them indicated. And then one of the ones that we've noticed is the question of whether economists are subject to the same motivation as everybody else, whether economists are self-interested. And Rose favors the self-interested thing, Milton not so much. And the sharpest statement of the self-interested economist that we've seen is in the preface to the LSE reprint of Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, where the collective action problem of economics could have been written by Gordon Tullock. And is it that sharp? So the question of, and as a personal note, I sent Friedman, Milton, I sent him an off-print when I was, making the argument that the self-interested economist mucks up this central planning argument. And he wrote back very quickly saying, A, you shouldn't say such naughty things, and B, you don't know the half of it.
Yeah, David Levy, a question to both, and it's about this Knight connection. We know that Aaron director Rose, Milton were close to Knight, and George Stigler too, but the two directors started out working for Paul Douglas. And in 1932, Paul Douglas wrote a long book, which he didn't mention in his autobiography, called The Coming of a New Party, dedicated to Norman Thomas, which is a paean of praise to economic planning. Now, do you guys know what happened and went on there? I've been trying to find out about this for years and nobody's talking.
So I think, Rob Van Horn has done some really excellent research reconstructing directors' pre-Chicago history. And I have written on this. I can share some of the narrative I've developed around it. I think that, Aaron Director was a crusader looking for a cause, and, perhaps a bit more simpatico with Knight, characterologically, in terms of their skepticism. And Douglas made the fatal flaw of leaving Chicago for a year, leaving Aaron Director unsupervised, and he got swept into the charismatic circle around Knight, and that's it. I mean, there's a lot of stories of Knight sort of mesmerizing. Samuelson called him the Pied Piper, and I think he was just more charismatic. I mean, you've written some about how, directors in Douglas's book almost looks like Director kind of pulled Douglas off his moorings for a little bit, and so I think there was a bit of a tug of war, and then it was a better relationship all around, although poor Douglas, really didn't get treated very well in the aftermath, so.
Wherever you find Rose Director, you're going to have archival problems. And we have a really simple-minded one, and that is we're doing some work on the history of when the rating agencies, the Moody's, Standard, and that sort of stuff, came into regulation. And there's a massive National Bureau FDIC project that got put to see how the rating agencies did about predicting defaults and the like. Okay. The young National Bureau staff person on that study was a certain Rose Director. Okay? When I found that out, it was a year too late to make a phone call. And I asked, of course, would ask David next time I saw him. His mom never talked about it. I looked in their joint autobiography, that's not there. And there's all sorts of connections about the rating agencies and policy that I think Rose Director had a link in, that one of the things that really stands out in the archives is how they handle Pauly's criticism. And of course, she was a RA of Pauly. And so there's all sorts of questions that I was a year too late to ask. And I don't think the archives are going to be good enough to replace that phone call.
I think we can adjourn. It's been a very interesting, certainly for me, session. and I can't help but point out the contemporary relevance of a lot of the discussion. It could have been about the last 10 years as much as it could have been about the 1930s. But thank you all for coming, and let's thank the panelists.